Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, welcome back to Keen on America. My take as an insider-outsider on the state of this remarkably complicated and controversial country, perhaps the most complicated and controversial country in history. I'm always looking for guests on the show who somehow capture a spirit, perhaps even the spirit of the country. And my guest today, Shaka Senghor, I think might be an example of that. He has a new book out. It's called How to Be Free. He's the author of a number of books. Some of you will be familiar with his Writing My Wrongs. It was a New York bestseller. And Shaka is joining us from his home in West Los Angeles. Shaka, welcome to Keen on America. Congratulations on the new book, How to Be Free. Do you think of yourself as an American? Is that a question that any American should even ask themselves?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. And I think it's a great question that we all should be asking ourselves. And this is the first time someone actually has asked me, do I think of myself as an American? Just to give some context, I grew up thinking of myself very much as an American. My dad was in the United States Air Force, where he served 35 years in the Air Force Reserves. And it wasn't until I went to Germany in 2015 that I began to question, like, what is the idea of being an American for someone who has been convicted of a crime. And when you lose your freedom to incarceration, how do you regain a sense of what it means to be a free citizen in this country? And I'm still not certain if there's a real answer there, because there are certain accesses to citizenship that I no longer have as a result of having a felony.
Yeah, it's of course a country full of paradoxes and ironies. Perhaps the greatest irony of all about America is, on the one hand, it prides itself on freedom. It was built on the premise and promise of freedom. On the other hand, I think it's a country now still with the largest criminal prison complex in the world. I think it rivals the Chinese. So it's both very free and very unfree. Your own story, Shaka, is intimately bound up with this. For people who aren't familiar with you, tell us how you experience the American criminal justice system.
Yeah, so I grew up in the city of Detroit, in a very tough household, which I ran away from when I was a kid, and I ended up getting seduced into the crack cocaine trade, which was relatively new at that time. This was back around 1986 or so. And when I got seduced into that culture, I experienced all the horrors that come with it. A childhood friend was murdered. I was robbed at gunpoint. I was beat nearly to death. And 3 years into that culture, I was shot multiple times. And when I got shot, there was no therapeutic outlets for, this young 17-year-old, which I was at the time. And so I processed that trauma in the most unhealthy of ways. I began to create a narrative that if I found myself in those circumstances, that I would shoot first. And tragically and unfortunately, about 16 months or so later, I got into a conflict and I fired multiple shots that tragically ended a man's death. I was subsequently arrested, charged with open murder, and sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison, where I eventually served a total of 19 years, with 7 of those years being in solitary confinement. And after that sentence was served, I was released back to society 15 years ago. So I've been free now for 15 years, free from prison for 15 years, but not free of all the consequences of being in the judicial system and having, an experience that I wish, if there was a magic wand I can go back and undo, I would. But unfortunately, that's not how life works out. And so I've been navigating, freedom post incarceration for the past 15 years.
Yeah, and your new book is called How to Be Free, a proven guide to escaping life's hidden prisons. We'll get to those hidden prisons later in the conversation, Shaka. They're not always formal prisons. But what did you learn about freedom in jail, the actual jail time that you spent? You said, how many years did you say you were in jail?
So I was in prison for a total of 19 years, and 7 of those years was in solitary confinement. The thing that I would say, the biggest lesson I learned from that time in prison is that I was actually incarcerated before I ever stepped foot in a prison cell, because the psychological and emotional damage that occurred early in childhood, really created a narrative that my life could only have one or two outcomes, that I would be dead or in jail by 21. And so I ended up living out that narrative. And I found that to be common amongst a lot of the men I served time with, is that the idea that our lives had limitations and that there were only these two outcomes was a powerful narrative that led to the actions that we lived our life by. And I found that to be true as well in society, because what I realized and I discovered was that I was able to free myself long before I was ever released from the actual prison.
Some people might be listening to this, Shaka, and thinking to themselves, here's a guy who grew up in very difficult circumstances who suggests that there was something inevitable about you being drawn into the drug business and then shooting someone. We can always find examples of people born into similar circumstances who didn't go to jail, who made something of themselves without the experience of the criminal justice system. You've done both. You've, on the one hand, done your time, and on the other hand, you represent in many ways the conventional classic American dream. How would you respond to those kind of critics?
Yeah, what I've come to understand, living a life that's very public, and it comes with a ton of criticism. It comes with a ton of very binary ideas about what they think of someone who comes from those circumstances. And what I say to them is that you have to understand the nuance. One, an explanation isn't an excuse. What I try to do is give people the full picture, as opposed to the 1 minute snapshot of a 30-second decision that I made at the age of 19, and it's ownership, right? Like I'm completely responsible for that decision. The time that I served, that was the time that the judge handed down, and I accepted that responsibility and everything that came with it. But I can only tell you my story and my experience and how I internalized the traumas that I navigated. And I've seen other people go through those same traumas and come out on the other side with a different outcome. And that's the complexity of what it means to be American. That's the complexity of what it means to be human, is you can put many of us in the same circumstances, and as many people you put in those circumstances, you will produce the same amount of different results. So I don't really give too much attention to critics, because at the end of the day, it's their personal opinion, and everybody is subject to have one.
You could always shoot them, Shaka. I'm sorry, but rather poor joke there. But
it's all good.
There seems to be two ways of thinking about prison, or two conventional ways, and they're not really compatible. On the one hand, it's a place for punishment. That you shot someone, you killed someone, presumably they weren't entirely innocent, but they certainly didn't deserve to die. So you needed to be punished for that wrong. On the other hand, prison is a place of re-education, of recreation. I'm guessing your view of prison falls into the second category. Was your experience, though, more in terms of the first way of thinking about prison, just as a way of punishing you?
Yeah, so we have a very complex prison system here in America. Every state has a different system. So we have over 50 systems. We have a federal, state by state, and everybody is at different, on different ends of the spectrum when it comes to whether it's punishment or rehabilitation. I am really fortunate, right? I was lucky. There's the stories that we talk about when it comes to luck in America. If you're lucky to be born a certain race, there's opportunities that exist for that. If you're born in a certain zip code, there's opportunities. If you're born a certain gender, so on it goes. The luck of the biological or environmental draw. For me, my luck, which I emphasize very clearly, is that I was literate before I went to prison. The average reading grade level in prison is third grade. And so, because I was able to read, I was able to turn my cell into a university. Without that ability, I'm not sure that I would have been able to transform my life. And so, it wasn't a reflection of the prison, which was very punitive back when I went in. I went in 1991, before a lot of the criminal justice
Yeah,
reform took
which
place.
prison were you in?
So I was in Michigan. I spent, out of the 19 years, I served time in 11 different prisons in 5 different security levels. So from the highest security level, which is solitary confinement, all the way down to minimum security, which is the least restrictive. But for me, it was punitive, but I was able to turn it into restorative because of being literate and having great mentors inside, which I think is key for anybody's transformation. It's not a solo journey. You really need support.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about literacy. We got an upcoming show with somebody else who served in prison, who learned to quilt in prison and sees that as their path in a way to set reinvention and freedom. So I'm guessing for you, Shaka, it's not just maybe writing, it's creativity. It's being able to do something, write, paint, read, something that enables you to build yourself, to mature yourself, to reinvent yourself.
Absolutely. I think being able to engage our mind in any cognitive process is one of the most therapeutic things that we can do. And what happens is when you're in a punitive process where everything is punishment, like your brain doesn't even function the same way. And I say it because I've actually experienced it, early in my sentence, the shock of being in such a brutal environment. Like, it was hard to imagine a life beyond that environment. But once I awakened my mind to the power of literature to kind of take me away, and sometimes it was fiction, being able to escape into those other worlds. And then for me, the writing process was very meditative. And I didn't start off writing books. I started off journaling. And that journaling allowed me to get super honest with myself, super real, accept responsibility for the decisions I had made, be accountable for the rest of my life, take charge of the future that I wanted to imagine. And none of that would have been possible without being able to create or use the written word as a meditative therapeutic process.
And you write about this, excusing the pun, in your first book, Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, and Redemption in an American Prison, which was a big hit. Is this proof? I want to come to the How to Be Free, your new book, in a second, Shaka, but is your narrative and this book and its success and your success really examples of the way in which the American dream, or at least the American promise, still exists? Some people have suggested that it no longer exists, but are you a model in a way for the American dream?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the greatest things about this country is that you get an opportunity to create your own luck. And sometimes that luck comes through the filter of hard scrabble backgrounds. But nevertheless, if you have that, ambition, desire, goal, and you can see the opportunity, you can lean into it. Like, I didn't just wake up one day on the New York Times bestseller list. When I got out of prison, I hustled books out of the trunk of my car. I would go everywhere people were, parks, neighborhood bars, local hangouts, and I would just sell books. And to me, that's the cornerstone of American entrepreneurship. It's the cornerstone of the American dream, that you can, really dig yourself out of the hole. But you need support. You need care. You need a certain type of resilience. For me, I think that resilience was built by going through the most difficult of circumstances. and it's created the most incredible opportunities, and I seize those opportunities. Now, I won't sit here and make it seem like it was easy. I started writing 25 years ago. I wrote my first books while I was incarcerated, and I ended up writing Right My Wrongs because it was, as much as it was my story, it was the story of the men who I served time with, the men who mentored me, the men who guided me to books, and their childhood and our experiences, and how, when we look at what's happening in the society now, it's not a race thing. At one point we kind of leaned into criminality as, something exclusive to young Black inner city kids. And what I've grown to see, especially with fentanyl and opioids and the explosion of the prison system, is that this is a pandemic that affects and impacts all of us. And so, yeah, I think it is very much the American dream, is that you can, pull yourself up from the dregs of society and achieve, whatever you're willing to work toward.
Yeah, and of course, Alexis de Tocqueville, who I often refer to in this show, the French aristocrat who came to America, wrote Democracy in America, still perhaps the most influential and revered observer of America, came originally to see the American prison system, which at the time was perhaps more enlightened than the European model. I think the reverse is true now. So you've written these books, Shaka, on your experiences in jail, writing my wrongs in particular, and letters to the sons of society. But your new book kind of turns everything on its head. How to Be Free, a proven guide to escaping life's hidden prisons. Now, you're a man who spent a lot of his life in prison. Are you arguing in this new book that the world itself, and perhaps contemporary America, isn't quite as different from prison as, quote unquote, free people might like to think?
Absolutely. And the argument is really rooted in the hardcore realities that I've navigated post-incarceration, meeting people on book tour, meeting people at seminars who have not given themselves permission to heal from the things that ail them. What I experience when I'm out in public and I'm speaking is that people come up and they open up to me in the most candid of ways. And I mean, they're going deep very fast, talking about divorces and, suicidal ideation and navigating children who are, dealing with addiction and grief and shame and all these things. And what I realize is that we have way more in common than we have that separates us in terms of what it means to be a human. And especially, when we went through the pandemic together. And during that time, I had friends reaching out to me from every walk of life. I've been successful in my pursuits in entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, in the world of entertainment. And, within that network, some of the most accomplished people would reach out and say, Shaka, how do we get out of this? I am navigating the uncertainty of what life will look like post-pandemic, or if this thing will end. And so what I found is that we all have these hidden prison things that don't allow us to fully embrace the fullness, the joy, the love, the passion of life, because we're trapped in grief. We're trapped in shame, and it shows up in our work life, and it shows up in our relationships. It shows up in our parenting. And I wanted to provide people with not only a framework, but these practical tools that I used inside to free myself before they ever let me out of prison.
Yeah, and actually, again, thinking out loud about your argument and your intriguing life and experiences in How to Be Free, America is not just the home of the most troubling, shall we say, criminal justice system, but also the home of self-development, of self-reinvention. And in a way, you're taking your experience of jail and making yourself, maybe you've done this before, but particularly in this new book, How to Be Free, you're making yourself into a teacher, the kind of thing that people look for. On your website, you have the 10 things this book will teach you. Some people don't like this kind of way of doing books, but obviously others do. is it again, Shaka, a very American thing to recycle, perhaps relaunder one experience into lessons for everybody, which we're all desperate for?
Yeah, I think it's both American and I think it's also human. I mean, you think of what the idea of it is to be a parent. You're constantly trying to educate your children on past experiences. If you're a teacher in the classroom, you don't become a great teacher until you've taught, until you've learned lessons from the students who have come into your sphere of influence. And so for me, because I've had this incredible journey from being at the lowest point in my life to navigating my way to the highest levels of achievement that was possible for myself, what came with that is just a ton of lessons that are applicable across many sectors that I've actually lived in, right? So I'm not giving people something I haven't done. I was at a company that when I joined this company, it had a $4 billion valuation in
This
the
is Kellogg, right?
no, that was a fellowship. This is a company called Navan. It was just a travel and expense company that I was
Okay.
I was the VP of corporate comms. But joining that company,
Yeah, and
um,
you were also an MIT Media Lab Directors Fellow, so you've done a lot of different things.
absolutely, I've taught at the University of Michigan as well, which I do a lecture there every year. And what I discover is that we're all both students and teachers in life. But with these lessons that I learned in prison, it was mind blowing to see how they were able to solve problems in a corporate environment. I've led nonprofits, I've done fundraising for tons of orgs, and those lessons really applied. And that to me was when I was like, hey, I want to share this with people and give them the agency over their lives that they're really clamoring for, but also do it in a way that's authentically a lived experience and not me just kind of pulling something out of the kind of ethers and saying, here, take this stuff that I haven't applied to real life.
So as you say, you were a VP at Navan, which is a travel platform. You've been involved with MIT. You've given a number of popular TED Talks. You've been a fellow at the Kellogg Foundation. So you've done a lot, and you're applying your lessons to this in how to be free, about us having hidden prisons. But of course, you're best known as someone who spent a lot of time in prison. Some people, again, Shaka might be thinking to themselves, yeah, this sort of as an extended metaphor, maybe there's some truth in the notion that we all have hidden prisons. But it's pretty extended, and it's a very different kind of experience from overcoming those prisons in oneself, opening those doors, and the experience of prison. But you're saying it isn't. You're saying it's quite similar.
Absolutely, and I say this again, because I think this is the part that sometimes with personal development and self help that gets lost, is that this is a real lived experience. And what I can tell you with certainty is that about 70% of people who are incarcerated return back to prison.
Yeah.
The average reading grade level is third grade. The trauma that one experiences in that environment is very hard to heal from. The work that I did on my personal journey is the difference between me sitting here having this conversation with you and me dying in prison. And that's why I know that the prison is beyond the bars that hold you physically. And it's the deeper bars that is inside of our minds, inside of our hearts and our spirits, that are the real things that we have to break free from. And once I went on that journey, like, I knew that I would never be captive in any way, physically or psychologically, because I really understood the mechanisms it took to free myself up to even think. I mean, think about this, Andrew. I'm in solitary confinement, 23-hour lockdown in the most barbaric of environments, when I have this idea that my life can be different. The things that I live today are things that I wrote down before I ever knew if I was getting out of prison. That was the liberating force of journaling and meditation and mindfulness. And because I live what I wrote down and I still have those journals to this day, that is the proof that it was important for me to share with people, is that I'm not just giving you some anecdotal thing that has no real life application. I can tell you with certainty that the prisons in your mind are tougher than any prison cell block in America, and that the suffering from trauma, from grief, from shame is just as intense as it is when you're locked down and you're unable to physically move. And that's what this book offers, is a unique insight from a lived experience that comes with wisdom that has led me to a whole different space in the world, based on an idea that I had was possible for myself over 25 years ago.
So in the book, there's a lot about meditation and mindfulness, the other terms which are often very much bound up in our self-help industry and how to develop the self. What's missing, though, or what seems to be missing from your narrative, which one often finds in these kind of American narratives, is God and religion. Is there anything there, or is that the wrong door, shall we say, Shaka, to take?
No, I don't think it's the wrong door, but I can only give you the honest doors that I've walked through. I'm a very spiritual person. I believe that we are all connected, energetically, spiritually. And I think the way that we frame our religious beliefs are just unique to us culturally. And to me, that's of lesser importance than the actual spiritual connection we have as human beings. And I didn't want to get lost in a thing that's not true for me. But it doesn't ignore what's true for the person, right? So for some people, prayer is their answer. Scripture is their answer. For me, life is scripture. When I'm out in in nature, I am amazed and astounded by the incredible, powerful idea that the sky is infinite, or that we haven't explored the fullness of the ocean. When I go and spend time out there, on the beach, and I'm looking off in the horizon, but that's my spiritual belief, which was important for me. But I think that religion, spirituality, wherever one arrives at, that brings them to a sense of deep connection with themselves and others, I think those doors are equally important.
The other thing that distinguishes America from many other countries, particularly in Western Europe, Australia, Canada, is its weak state, its absence of public services, which may be why your kind of narrative about teaching people how to invent and reinvent themselves is so popular. People don't have anything else. What about the role, though, of institutions, traditional institutions? Schools, family goes without saying, if you're lucky enough to have family. The government. Is there a place, in your view, for traditional institutions of power, like the government, church, of course, schooling, and how to be free? Or is this going to almost inevitably and unavoidably in America come from the self?
I think it's a mixture of things, right? When I think about the schools that I go and mentor at, the schools that get it right, they recognize that when you're educating a child, you're educating a whole human being. You're not just teaching them the basics of math and history and all the things that are important part of your learning process, but you also are teaching from a experience of realizing that all these kids come with different environmental factors, different family structures, etc. And I think there is a role within society to where these institutions should play the most, one of the greatest complementary roles to the family in the raising of children and ensuring that citizens have the support necessary to actually live what is the American dream. And I think in fairness, what has happened is that we have a blind spot as well as a sore spot in America. And our blind spot is that we don't like to get honest with the differences that exist from community to community. The school that my son goes to is dramatically different from the school in the community that I come from. Those are just the facts. And so the expectation in terms of access to opportunities is very different from inner city schools with meager resources. So I think the government, if we're going to be honest about what is happening in America, has to have some type of responsibility when it comes to where are we allocating resources and how are we not trying to make it seem as if everybody has a fair start. This is not factually not true. And I think the sore spot is that we have dealt with race in a very binary way. It's an either or proposition, as opposed to there is a lot of nuance that comes with culturally what it means to be an American. And we just need to say that out loud, and we need to practice what we preach, because freedom from a citizenship standpoint means that we can have honest conversations. It means that we can have conversations that aren't always the most comfortable. And most of us probably do it in our personal life. It's more the public life where we get kind of lost into all these superficial arguments that ultimately doesn't lead our country in the right direction.
Finally, Shaka, what's your take on the state of America in August of 2025? Your new book, How to Be Free, talks about a proven guide, or promises itself as a proven guide to escaping life's hidden prisons. America, of course, in the late summer of 2025 is a very controversial place run by a very controversial administration. It's divided particularly between people who are legally in this country and those that aren't, and the prison, shall we say, established between these two. Are you optimistic about the America of August 2025? What would you like to see changed?
Yeah, I think I am. I think I'm optimistic, really because of my experience and my circumstance that I come from. So I wouldn't compare my optimism to anybody who hasn't walked in my shoes. But what I'm really optimistic about is what it means to actually be human. And I think this is our greatest opportunity to lean on each other in a meaningful way. I personally don't get too lost into the politics of the country. It's not my background experience. I've worked with both both parties on criminal justice reform work, which I've done literally for the 15 years I've been out of prison. I've helped pass policies and bills, and what I've found is that on those core issues, there's a lot of similarities in terms of what people believe. Oftentimes, we may not be in agreement of how we get there, but I can say I've saw glimmers of hope that we can work together to reduce, the prison population and to ensure that people have the tools needed to re-enter society as assets instead of liabilities. So that gives me a glimmer of hope, is that, that work will still be done. Tough circumstances, I think, brings out the best in people, or the worst. And in prison, I got a chance to see that firsthand, how people would rally around each other during their toughest moments. And I think that is true for this opportunity we have, but we got to see it as an opportunity. And that takes courage, and it takes different type of conversation to take conversation that steps a little bit out of the politics and leans more into our humanity. And I think the more that we do that, the better opportunities we'll create for ourselves and others.
And perhaps it requires a conversation with an American like Shaka Senghor, the author of a very intriguing new book, How to Be Free, another one of his remarkable life lessons. Shaka, congratulations on the new book. Love to get you back on the show, because you're a man who, perhaps more than many others, are honestly reflecting on your life and the history of this unique country. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad to come back anytime.